Today, the topic is, unfortunately, rather a heavy one. We will be covering mass shooters and the phenomenon known as stochastic terrorism, which can be loosely understood as when propaganda about a group of people inspires acts of violence against those people. Today, that means mass shootings and bombings. The racist screeds penned by these terrorists reveal the ideology behind these attacks. In this video, we will be looking at the nature of these attacks and their direct link to the right-wing ideology that motivates these random acts of violence. To understand how this phenomenon came to be, we will take a brief look at the history behind it. To keep things simple, we will focus on the three waves of the Ku Klux Klan, as they were the most prominent forms of right-wing violence in their respective times. The first wave comes about shortly after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. The abolition of chattel slavery and the loss in the war had broken the back of the Confederate States. The social situation was shifting quickly, and those who would see that institution of white supremacy restored took matters into their own hands. From poor white farmers to white workers fearful of black competition to anti-labor employers and Democrat politicians. Resentful white people would form their own chapters, never with any real organizational structure, to terrorize the populace. While generally terrorizing black people, they would also harass other whites on suspicions, valid or not, of sympathy with their primary targets. This wave of insurgent violence did not last long. Counter-terror resistance groups, as well as federal prosecution, would squash it only a few years after the war, by around 1872. The lack of organization and the constant threat of violence people lived under would prove their undoing. Two things the second wave would try to rectify. The Birth of a Nation, a 1915 film mythologizing the original Klan, inspired its reformation as a proper organization, with a broader scope and more political activity than the original. While it retained the overt white supremacy of the first wave, this second wave would attack anything that was seen as un-American. At the time, that meant alcohol. This was the era of prohibition. Adultery was also seen as a great problem. Catholics, immigrants, and of course black people were all seen as threats to the white man. Later on, it would also take on anti-communism, reflecting the bourgeois interest of the original incarnation. These are generally wealthy, propertied men, after all. Under the quasi-mystical notions of purity, patriotism, and order, however, there was the same violence. Additionally, much of the leadership was crooked, even by these profoundly low standards. Leadership cared little for grassroots concerns. For many, such as former Grand Dragon D.C. Stevenson, saw simply the Klan as a means to wealth and power. He was convicted of second-degree murder in 1925 for the rape and subsequent death of a white schoolteacher, Madge Oberholzer, and Klan membership dropped sharply in the following year, with entire chapters disbanding almost immediately. Protecting the purity of white women was revealed for the lie it was. Naked, self-interested violence was at the heart of the Klan, as always. It would linger on for years afterward, but hampered by its ruined reputation and infiltration which demystified the organization. The third and final wave brings back the decentralized form of the original, as well as the greater focus on insurgent violence, generally bombings. Each group was independent of the others, and directly acted within and around their own communities to terrorize their targets, almost always black neighborhoods. This was the civil rights era. As always, the violence in these reactionary movements is a reply to the social conditions of the time. These groups would often form political alliances with police in order to act with impunity. This is a characteristic that remains today, demonstrated by the nature of police presence at events like the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. Groups would specifically target civil rights activists when possible, using intimidation, beatings, and assassinations. Police would often not intervene, and when charges were pressed, disenfranchisement ensured lenient sentencing when convictions happened at all. However, Supreme Court decisions extended civil rights protections in the mid-20th century. From this point on, membership would begin to decline. For a more contemporary example, fast forward to 1995. A pair named Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols detonated a truck full of explosives at the Alfred P. Murrah Building in Oklahoma City. Inspired by the novel The Turner Diaries and angered at the Waco siege, in which federal forces clashed with an apocalyptic cult called the Branch Davidians, ending in the defeat of said cult as their compound burned down. Ostensibly, their anger was about government overreach. However, their reading of the diaries, in which the victory of the protagonists involves total ethnic cleansing, and their shared survivalist mindset with the cult, reveal that the bombers took the Waco siege as the initiation of an attack against American patriots. Here, we can already see the shift away from overt white supremacist motivations. The motives of the bombers were exactly that, but hidden enough that they could be overlooked in coverage of the attack. White supremacist violence continues to this day, but the form it's taken has shifted, away from the small terror cells of the Klan and towards that of individual acts. As the previous section shows, while the form of organisation and the particular tactics used by reactionary terrorists change, the core remains mostly unchanged. Today's right-wing terrorists are still motivated by the same racism, sexism, queerphobia, and social reaction that their predecessors were. However, this says nothing about how they got those motivations to begin with. While there isn't a strict formula to be followed, general trends can be observed. In today's digitized age, much of the material that radicalizes these people comes from the internet. Image boards, neo-Nazi forums, right-wing YouTube ideologues, all of them contribute material that develops the radicals' understanding, for lack of a better term, of the world. In addition, referring back to the forums as an example, there is a certain sense of community among these right-wing radicals, wherein they collectively radicalize each other through a reactionary kind of discourse. That is, there isn't just passive material that the radical encounters and absorbs, but also active engagement with the other radicals and development of their reactionary ideology through it. This experience is extremely isolating, to the point that all of their socialization and identity becomes subsumed with their increasingly reactionary ideology. Obviously, people don't just start browsing Nazi sites on a whim. They have to have already been invested in their right-wing narratives. This investment may come from a political event in their lifetime, or a text, or other ideological work they read. For example, McVeigh's witnessing the Waco siege, or Dylan Roof's investigation into the murder of Trayvon Martin. Once motivated in this way, they typically start researching things related to their particular case. Roof researched black-on-white murders, for instance. This leads them to the same sources as before, such as reactionary online forums. Often, the ideas that push them to conduct this kind of research are easily found in the mainstream. After all, black-on-white crime is hardly an innocent concept to be researching, and it wasn't pulled from the ether. Fox News, for instance, often runs stories on interracial crime when the victims are white, while insisting that nobody talks about it. The concept that white people, men, or heterosexuals are the victims of some pervasive but unacknowledged violence is a fascist conspiracy theory, but you can hear it right on national television.
Accept this. We have a moral obligation to admit the world's poor, they tell us, even if it makes our own country poorer and dirtier and more divided. Immigration is a form of atonement. Previous leaders...
That's Fox News' Tucker Carlson on immigration, not a far-right image board, and it's far from the worst things he said publicly. At another point, referring to the war in Iraq.
I mean, Iraq is a crappy place filled with a bunch of, semi-literate primitive monkeys. That's why it wasn't worth invading.
And Fox News isn't the only outlet. Ben Shapiro of the Daily Wire, and formerly Breitbart, said this on his Twitter.
Israelis like to build. Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. This is not a difficult issue. #settlements rock.
Blatantly reactionary sentiment is openly broadcast on a daily basis. Local news channels, movies, video games, and television also reinforce these ultra-conservative narratives. It's not obscure or fringe as you might be led to believe. It's pervasive through all of Western, especially American, culture. Eventually, their radicalization hits a point where they decide to take radical action, and they begin planning their attacks. Across all of these cases, the planning phase is more or less the same. All of these shooters will pick a day to act, plan how they will enter and attack a location, and many have a heavy, almost fetishistic focus on the aesthetic of the gear they use to kill. The shooters often focus so much on the less important elements, neglecting possibly the most important part, the location. Most of the time, mass shooters will just pick a densely populated, accessible location that is relatively close to home. This, more often than not, means the local schools. Because of lack of focus on choosing a location, we can see from the recent mass shootings that, while racial, gendered, or general conservative ideology is deeply important to the reason, it is not for the victims. These attacks are never meant to be considered in isolation. The frequency with which these shooters and bombers leave manifestos detailing their reasoning reveals that the action they take is not only meant to terrorize their targets, but inspire others to do the same. Rather than advocating a return to older societal forms of government, they are frequently marked by a distrust of government as is. They seek to destroy, or at least radically alter society through enacting violence on their own, because they don't think the existing system is capable of bringing about the change they want. To put it crudely, they generally seek to bring about a kind of conservative revolution. Their motivations stem from the core of right-wing ideology: nationalism, racial prejudice, sexism, etc. But you wouldn't know it by just following the mainstream representation of these people. Mainstream media has an almost pathological dedication to downplaying these tragedies and the nature of their perpetrators when they happen. There is an unspoken but obvious refusal to admit the nature of the ideology that motivates these killers. Many deflections and distractions are employed to this end. Mental illness and gun control are the two most common concepts trotted out. Many more become absurd on their face, like playing Doom or smoking weed. We'll start with gun control. Shifting the topic towards firearms regulations focuses our attention on preventing right-wing radicals from having the ability to commit mass murder, rather than suppressing the radicalization of these people to begin with. Additionally, gun control is never seriously considered as an option outside of disarming people of color, as we can see from the governorship of Ronald Reagan in California as he tried to disarm Black and Latinx self-defense communities. There is no genuine political will behind this proposed solution. As for mental illness, this tries to portray the perpetrators as outliers by centering on their mental condition. If shooters are just mentally ill, then nothing needs to be done. The implication is that normal people, radicals or no, don't carry out these kinds of attacks. Often, this line mixes with the line on gun control, and a compromise for simply prohibiting the mentally ill from owning weapons is proposed. But we know that, simply put, most mass shooters are not mentally ill. Most people with mental illnesses are more likely to be victims of violence rather than perpetrators. All of these lines just obscure the shooter's ideological motives. To admit that these killers were motivated by right-wing ideology, if done at all, is quickly brushed aside in favour of these politically convenient lines. Most often, the conservative political motives of these attacks are totally hidden behind the media's misdirections and fear-mongering. We can see these omissions in the media's representation of the attacks in what is perhaps the most infamous of all school shootings: Columbine. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold have generally been portrayed as bullied outcast, deranged lunatics, or some combination of the two. In reality, they took much of their inspiration from the ideas of people like Charles Manson and Timothy McVeigh, as well as frequently quoting Nazi writings in their schoolwork and possessing copies of Mein Kampf. In addition, the two kids were causing social alienation and mental stress on other students while not suffering it themselves. The shooters were the bullies, not the bullied, and reports from the survivors said that they especially enjoyed bullying students of color. In their journals and tapes, they make quite clear they aim to spark greater violence in others with their actions at the school. They simultaneously believed themselves to be the apex of humanity, and yet hated themselves, evidenced by their desire to die in the course of their plans. Here, it is important to note how their particular lives were shaped by reactionary, fascist ideology. The inherent violence in these right-wing ideas shaped their discontent into aggrieved entitlement. They saw morality as a meaningless concept. They viewed themselves as superior and their peers as inferior, and their right-wing beliefs told them might makes right, so the shooters thought they could do with them as they wished. You're unlikely to hear much of this from mainstream reporting. Media will focus on their history of being bullied, without mentioning them actually being the bullies. It will blame music, despite them being fans of bands that openly opposed violence. They'll talk for hours about how they were supposedly influenced by Marilyn Manson, but not Charles Manson. They'll mention Rammstein and their militarist aesthetics, but not the actual militarism of the Nazis that Eric and Dylan admired. This event demonstrates two important points about reactionary ideology. One, that its influence is always downplayed and obscured when it produces violence that hits too close to home. Second, and maybe a subtler point, it turns in on the very society that produces it. Not content to privately hold beliefs about the inferiority of other human beings, reactionaries turn these beliefs into action. If others are inferior, then they can be treated however the superiors wish. If morality and justice mean nothing, or are totally relative, then anything can be permitted. This is the danger of this kind of ideology. It turns crude self-interest into the highest principle to be followed, by any means necessary. The absurdity of calling this mass violence random is laid clear. It is a continuation of the historical trend of right-wing violence, and the logical conclusion of radical right-wing ideology that we are all inundated with on television, radio, and online. From public figures like Ben Shapiro or Tucker Carlson, to the hordes of reactionaries in online forums, to even government officials, we are drowned in these far-right, radical ideas. So grimly, it is no surprise that a nationwide reported mass shooting happens almost once a month. And when reported, the media obscures the reasons for this violence, with calls to take away self-defense and further stigmatization of the marginalized. Taking away guns won't solve mass shooting. Locking up the mentally ill won't solve mass shootings. Only dealing with a radical, right-wing rot that plagues our society will. If you liked our video, please like and subscribe. And if you have any ideas or criticisms, please leave a comment down below. If you want to support us, you can become a patron at patreon.com/ACTSoviet. You can also check out our Twitter page @ACTSoviet, as well as the profiles for some of the folks who worked on this video. All of the links will be down in the description, and be sure to look out for future ACTS projects. Thank you for watching.